Stalingrad is remembered as one of history's most famous engagements. But what if the most remarkable and terrifying part of the story only began after the active conflict stopped? More than 90,000 men marched into the frozen unknown of Soviet captivity, but years later, only a tiny fraction would ever see their homes again. They didn't just lose an operational campaign, they vanished from the face of the earth. Where did they go? What happened to them during a decade of silence? And what secrets remained buried until archives began opening decades later? These 8 haunting revelations from Stalingrad's lost Sixth Army expose how an operational setback became a decade of vanishing lives, the encirclement that sealed a city. In November 1942, Soviet commanders Vasily Chuikov in the ruins and Georgy Zhukov in the field pulled a double envelopment that the opposing forces called the Cauldron. Operation Uranus snapped shut around more than 250,000 opposing personnel. The mighty Sixth Army, once the spearhead of the Eastern Front, found itself cut from fuel, bread, and hope. This matters because the siege was not just an operational loss. It created the human catastrophe that would echo for years in Soviet facilities, memoirs, and political theater, Beckovka, and the movement into captivity. The transition was not orderly. It was a collapse. Cold, hunger, and chaos greeted the captured personnel at improvised transit points, like the Beckovka facility south of Stalingrad. Personnel in charge stripped boots and coats in a winter that took lives in hours. Rations failed to arrive, or arrived too late. In weeks, tens of thousands lost their lives to dysentery, severe illness, exposure, and untreated injuries. Historians estimate that as many as half of all who would perish in captivity lost their lives before they ever reached permanent facilities. This matters because the image of columned captured personnel hides the reality that many never made it to a registry line. Inside GUPVI, the shadow twin of the labor system. On paper, captured personnel were handled by a separate directorate. In practice, the GUPVI facilities ran on the same logic as the broader labor system. Forced labor, rations tied to quotas. A severe equation that kept men barely alive if they produced and deprived them if they fell behind. From the Volga to the Urals, from the Donbass mines to Siberian forests, Stalingrad personnel rebuilt what conflict had shattered. This matters because captivity became a system, not a moment, and the system measured survival in shifts and spades. Generals turned into propaganda weapons. 24 German generals, including Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, were separated and courted. Better rooms, books, interrogations, then the microphones. With Soviet guidance, the National Committee for a Free Germany was born. Radio appeals urged soldiers to lay down arms and denounce leadership. Some officers acted from conviction, others yielded to pressure or calculation. Paulus would sign appeals after the failed plot against leadership in July 1944. This matters because it shows how success on the Volga was leveraged into political coordination that foreshadowed the new East Germany, medicine on the edge of starvation. Among the captured personnel were doctors who fought a losing struggle against hunger and disease with almost no supplies. Hans de Bold described hearts cannibalized by the body, edema that swelled legs as men succumbed to hunger, and the hazardous shock of sudden refeeding. Illness rode on lice. Tuberculosis settled in lungs hollowed by cold and labor. Clinics were tents and scrap wood. This matters because their testimonies are clinical ledgers of suffering and the closest thing we have to an anatomy of loss in captivity. Trials where justice and theater collided. Long before international tribunals became a symbol, the Soviets staged trials naming severe crimes. In 1947, a dozen generals faced charges in Moscow for atrocities during the campaign. Sentences were heavy, though often short of capital punishment. Procedure mixed evidence with propaganda. Yet the crimes were real. The loss of Soviet personnel, the burning of villages, the reprisals against civilians. This matters because the line between justice and display was thin, but the record it left is part condemnation and part geopolitical message. The bargained homecoming of 1,955. Repatriation came in waves. The sick first, then many rank and file. The last great return followed a bargain. West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer flew to Moscow in 1955. Diplomatic recognition was exchanged for people. Trains rolled into the Friedland Reception Center with men who had been gone more than a decade. Some found families, others stepped into silence. This matters because international diplomacy turned the fate of individuals into a currency, and because their return forged powerful memories in West and East alike. the final number, and the memory that refuses to settle. About 91,000 went into Soviet hands. Perhaps 6,000 came home. For every 100 captured at Stalingrad, only 6 or 7 returned. Early losses in the winter of 1,943. Years of disease, labor, and accidents. Records that do not align. Names misspelled or missing. Meanwhile, German memory split. In the West, soldiers as victims of a criminal regime. In the East, political redemption led by compliant officers. Archives opened after 1991 narrowed the gaps, but did not erase them. This matters most because it reveals a truth beyond numbers. Stalingrad did not end with the transition. It bled into a decade of captivity, into politics and reconstruction, into final resting places that still surface, and into stories that refuse to sit quietly in a ledger. In the end, these 8 revelations trace a single arc, from a city encircled, to a system that swallowed men, to a homecoming bought across a diplomatic table, and to a memory still contested. Stalingrad was an intense engagement. For its captured personnel, it was a life sentence that only a few survived.